quickly introduce myself and Frameworks. As Denzel mentioned, I am a sociologist and I research at the Frameworks Institute. And actually, before I came to Frameworks, I was a study director for an expert panel on the integration of immigrants into American society at the National Academy of Sciences, and I was co-editor of the report that panel produced along with Mary Waters. So immigration is something that I'm really passionate about, and I'm glad I get to share my work with you today. So what is Frameworks? We are a social science think tank that helps nonprofits, foundations, researchers, and advocates reframe social issues across a wide range of topics, including education, criminal justice, public safety, climate change, and of course, immigration. So as you can see, we are a very multidisciplinary team. I'm one of 3 sociologists, but we have people from a lot of different disciplines on our staff. And what makes us different from other communications organizations is that we use social science to understand how people think about different issues on a very deep level, not just what they say they think about these issues. So we believe that understanding how people think is the key to changing their minds and persuading them to support good social policies. So at Frameworks, we always start from the assumption that people's minds are actually very complex. A lot of communication strategies start with the assumption that the public are sort of like blank slates. They're sort of empty fish bowls. You're going to drop your communications in, they're going to swim around happily, and people will better understand your issues. But what we actually know from social science research is that this is not the case. People's minds are not empty fish bowls. Instead, people's minds are more like swamps. So there are already a lot of things in people's mind, what we call cultural models. These are the shared assumptions and ways of thinking that people bring to any discussion. It's their sort of shortcuts for understanding the world around them. And like a swamp, this is a very complex ecosystem. So there are alligators in here. There are bad things that are going to eat your messages, but there's also orchids and potentially useful things, sort of fertile soil for your communications, but you just need to know where they are and you need to know how to find them. So all of the research we do starts with mapping out this swamp because we have a lot of cultural models that inform our understanding of any topic. And I want to emphasize here, and I'll probably say this again, a lot of these cultural models that we have in mind may be conflicting or even contradictory, but the sort of amazing thing about people's minds is that we can hold the contradictory or conflicting understandings in our head and access these different models depending on what we hear or see and what we don't hear or see. And these models are actually available to all of us. So the key for communications is making sure you know which models you're going to cue when you're talking to somebody or when you're writing something. So I'm going to show you a video that demonstrates what the swamp of understanding is for immigration. And this is a video that we shot just a few years ago with folks literally on the streets. So these are people that were willing to talk to us, and we asked them what they thought of when they heard the words immigrant or immigration. And I want to emphasize that these are your audience. These are everyday people, everyday voters. And I'll just let you see and hear what they had to say when they heard.
What comes to mind when you think about the immigration system?
What comes to mind? I don't know much about the system.
What do you mean?
I don't know much about it.
Honestly, I don't know that much about the actual process.
I don't know a lot about it.
It's very complicated, I think.
Everybody from everywhere is coming to the U.S.
A lot of immigrants everywhere.
Multiply more and more.
Overflood of Mexicans here, you know?
It's overpopulated with more people that are foreign.
Mexicans.
They
cross the border and stuff.
Mostly illegally.
That the border needs to be closed, needs to be sealed.
In a way, we're all immigrants.
That's what America is based on.
We're trying to get the American dream.
What do you think are the effects of people that are living here without proper documentation?
I think they should be gone.
The effects of that is more crime.
People don't follow guidelines, and they try to come here illegally.
Illegal.
They have no way of tracking them.
You know, they take jobs away from hardworking Americans.
Taking jobs away from people here that need to be employed.
They're getting all the good jobs.
They'll come in the country and work for less money.
Does the same job for less money.
So it's hard for us get jobs.
The illegals is getting everything when they come into the country.
If they come over, they get what they want.
Taken away from those that are really our citizens.
Because they don't pay taxes.
They don't have to pay taxes.
Not paying taxes.
And because they're not legal, that's money that's not being accounted for in the economy.
We as taxpayers end up paying a lot more.
Costing taxpayers more money.
Everybody gets everything that they need when they come here.
I think that takes a huge toll on us.
What do you think should be done about people who are here without legal status? Come over, take the oath. Bam, you're an American citizen.
Pass a citizen test and come here.
Tighten security.
More guards.
There should be more security.
Background checks.
Background checks.
Proper identification.
Keep track of them.
Especially with the terrorism.
Terrorism.
They can blow up one building and we're not going to know that was there.
So what did we just see in here? There are obviously a lot of things in people's minds already when you ask them about the immigration system and about undocumented people. And all of those things that you saw in the video are what you face whenever you're creating communications about immigration. So importantly, what you heard was a lot of alligators. There is a lot of them thinking. There's a lot of assumption that immigrants are Mexicans, that people who are undocumented are quote unquote illegal, that they're takers. There's zero-sum thinking. So the idea that the immigrants here that are coming here are taking our jobs, that they're a drain on the system, that they're being handed things. There's also punitive thinking. So we have to secure our border because of terrorism, but also the idea that if we just secure the border, people won't try and cross it anymore. So if we're just punitive enough, people will get the picture and not try and come into this country. And also on the lower left-hand side, you'll see fatalism. So fatalism is a problem that we face whenever we're arguing for social change and for good policy situations. And it is particularly pernicious when it comes to immigration. People think of immigrants as coming in a huge wave or a surge, that this is just politics as usual, nothing's ever going to get done. Also that the system is really big and very screwed up. And part of that is that there's what we call black box thinking. So you heard at the very beginning, a lot of people saying, well, I don't know that much about the system. Your average American knows almost nothing about the immigration system. To be honest, I think a lot of politicians don't know that much about it. It is very complex. That doesn't mean that it's unfixable, but it seems like a giant problem to fix. And it does, again, lead people to fatalism. So whenever you say something like broken immigration system, while it's true that it is a system that needs fixing, you're actually pushing people towards that sort of fatalistic thinking as something that will never be fixed. However, you also heard some more productive, useful understandings of immigration. They might have gotten a little lost in there, but there's some us thinking. So, you know, Americans often like to think of ourselves, we like to think of ourselves as humanists. We like to think we respect the dignity of other people, that we're all people. There's also nation of immigrants thinking, which is another useful thing, cultural model to be cueing. And importantly, there's also pragmatism. So, you know, we like to think of ourselves as good at making things work with what we have. That's one of our American values. So those are the understandings that you want to cue with your communications. And I'm going to say again, as I noted earlier, all of us, because we live in this shared culture, are capable of thinking in both these sort of negative ways and these very positive ways. So the important thing for all of us as we're creating communications, as we're writing op-eds, as we're talking to people, you know, over the Thanksgiving table, is to cue the productive ways of thinking, to think about how can I get whoever I'm discussing this with or whoever my audience is to think in that more humanist or pragmatic way. So I'm going to show you some tools for how to do that. So I'm going to discuss the framework's immigration narrative, and based on our research, which starts with knowing what's already in the swamp that I just show you, and then testing communications tools, or what we call frames, using social science methods, we're able to identify some better ways of talking about immigration that will cue those more productive ways of understanding. And it's really critical that you create a narrative around immigration. Even a tweet can have a narrative. And there's a lot of talk about storytelling these days, and we absolutely agree that storytelling is critical. But we think about storytelling a little bit differently than some other people do. It isn't just about going with your gut. It's about putting together a story that has testable elements and making sure that you help people understand why something matters, how systems work, and what the effective solutions are. So that's how you create stories that are intended for social change. So I want to start by talking about the fact that data is fantastic, but you can't just throw data out and assume that people are going to interpret it the way that you want it to. Facts alone aren't going to work because they aren't stories. And as human beings, we understand things better when it's told in a narrative or story form. So a key point about framing is that providing data is not the answer for convincing people of anything. And I see this all the time among well-meaning researchers and advocates. They'll tweet out or put on Facebook or just say a piece of information and then go, well, this data speaks for itself, assuming that people now think the same way that they do about that data. But we know from looking at the swamp that the data doesn't speak for itself because people already have these really complex and varied understandings that they're bringing to the topic that you're discussing. So giving them more data doesn't do the trick. People are interpreting your data using their previous understandings, and they might be doing it in some really unfortunate ways. So giving people more charts, more graphs, more tables, just piling on the evidence and thinking that it's going to lead to an epiphany actually doesn't work. So an example of this is presenting data on the economic impact of immigration. The numbers that you're showing might look really positive to you, right? So immigrants are definitely contributing to our economy. In fact, as David pointed out, they're contributing an outsized proportion to our economy compared to their numbers in our population. But if someone has that zero-sum thinking as the more dominant cultural model, those very same models can be interpreted, or very same numbers, excuse me, can be interpreted as immigrants are out there taking our jobs. Oh, immigrants are entrepreneurial. Well, they're taking away business from hardworking American citizens. And this is what can happen when you don't frame your data and explain why it's important and how things work. So you're just leaving doors open to other types of interpretations that you don't want to make. So providing more data is not the answer. Instead, you need to frame. So what is a frame? This is a set of choices that you're making either consciously or unconsciously when you talk about a topic. And what we identify at Frameworks are a set of choices that you can make when you talk or write about a specific topic. And this is less like a simple switch. You just turn on one master frame or turn off another one. And we think of it more as a sextant. So this is a set of tools, each of which does something a little bit different and works together to help you establish a larger narrative arc that will make your argument more accessible and get people thinking in the correct direction. So how do you build a narrative? You do this by telling a story about what this is all about. So immigration benefits all of us and our economy. But within that narrative that you're telling, there are additional frames. So the first is values. The second is your explanation of how this works. And the third is solutions. And when you put all of these things together, we found through our empirical testing that you not only get a better understanding of immigration and the immigration system, you also get a stronger sense of efficacy. So this idea that we can do something, we can have good immigration policies, and you get stronger support for those good policies like family reunification and a pathway to citizenship. And what makes a story, importantly, is not just the content, but it's the structure. So these aren't lists or poems. Effective stories for social change tell people why this matters, explains the problem, and provides solution as part of a narrative arc. And we actually tested each of these pieces separately and then put them together to see how powerful they could become when you put them all together in this way. So next I'll show you exactly what it was that worked. So to start with, our research showed that starting with values is the best way to begin a narrative about immigration. Importantly, we found that even when you're talking about the economy, starting with the moral argument works best when you're making the case about why this matters. And notably, our research that we did, we also looked at the materials that advocates were using and that were in the media. And what we found is that advocates tend to use either a moral argument or an economic argument. And I think what's really interesting about what our data showed is that you can frame an economic argument with a humanist or moral value. Those two things don't have to be separate arguments. They can actually be put together and they're stronger for it. So you can make the case for shared prosperity by first framing it as a moral imperative. And you'll see that there's another choice as well, which I'll get to a little bit later, which is talking about pragmatism. And I'll talk more specifically in a minute about when you want to use pragmatism as a value. So after you've used that value, after you start with that moral argument, something like we need to treat everyone with the compassion they deserve as human beings, and no matter where we were born, we're all people and all entitled to the same respect, then you start to present your facts. So how does immigration enhance our shared prosperity? Or how do the policies that we currently have not enhance our shared prosperity? Because of course we're in a situation right now where people's immigration status is being taken away from them, and we know that this is going to have negative economic impacts. But you can't just assert that, you actually have to explain what's going on. So you can say something like taking away DACA or TPS and stripping 1 million people of their work authorization is going to have a negative impact on our economy and shared prosperity for the following reasons. So things like employers are going to use valuable knowledge, they have to spend more money on hiring and training new workers, we're losing our tax base, etc. So the things that I just noted are important pieces of data. They're facts you want to get out there, but you need to explain why policies are going to lead to these specific things so that people really understand how the problem is working. And then at the end, and we always emphasize this, you have to provide solutions. You can't end with the facts. You have to give people solutions to combat their fatalism about getting anything done. And I think that this is particularly important in this political climate. There are common sense, reasonable solutions that Congress could be taking up. And you always want to tell people that so that they know what it is that they need to support. So I'm going to give you some examples of the moral or humanitarian value more specifically. So, you know, always talking about people's shared humanity and their common interests, demonstrating how the current system, particularly the things that have happened most recently, don't recognize immigrants' humanity. So our country should not be keeping family members apart or denying people basic assistance that they need in order to thrive. And also connecting any reform that we do enact to our ability to fulfill our moral obligation to other human beings. So treating all people with compassion, as opposed to say punitive measures, should be the goal of immigration reform in this country. So I just want to note here something about rights, because talking about immigration rights is something that a lot of immigrant advocates do. And I think rights are obviously a critical part of this argument, but they can't be used as a value. So you can't say and assert at the beginning, people have a right to be in this country, because Americans don't actually oftentimes believe that. They do understand rights, but not as a value when it comes to talking about immigration. So if you're going to talk about rights, I strongly recommend that you talk about use the moral argument to frame rights first, so that humanitarian argument. And our data bore this out. So, excuse me, sorry, you can see that the humanitarian argument was a much more effective way of discussing immigrants' contribution to society than rights. So starting with something about how no matter where you're born, we all deserve to be treated with kindness and respect. We should all live with dignity, and then talk about our rights as human beings. So I just wanted to note that, because I think that this is a mistake that often happens. So I mentioned pragmatism earlier. And I just want to flag that our research also showed that you really need to be flexible when you're making your arguments. So in a contested situation, if you're in a town hall, for instance, or having a conversation with your uncle who is against immigration, we found that actually the pragmatism value works best. So when people push back, when you make that moral argument and people push back, if you use a pragmatism value, it'll win back some of that support that maybe you were getting to. So again, pragmatism is about the fact that as Americans, we want to make sure that our system works well for everybody, and we really believe in using common sense. And a couple really great examples of this have come out. I think particularly mayors of big cities have been using this when they talk about sanctuary cities and the importance of having immigration, protecting their immigrant populations from the actions of ICE. So Eric Garcetti from Los Angeles, for instance, also Bill de Blasio of New York, have been talking about how current immigration enforcement is counterproductive because it scares people. That, you know, they're unwilling to talk to police, they're unwilling to open their doors. And actually having sanctuary cities improves public safety overall because now you have people in immigrant populations who are willing to talk to authorities. So that's a really good example of how the pragmatic value can be used to sort of push back against arguments against immigration. So my last few slides are just sort of a lesson in how you reframe. So this is a communication I found from a pro-immigration organization online, and it's presenting some really good economic data with the best of intentions. So I use the same data here, but I set it up by using the moral argument and talking about how we have a shared belief in the dignity of our fellow human beings, and also use pragmatism. So it's impractical to deport people. And then I presented the data about the economics that were presented in the before version. And then finally, I end with talking about a common sense solution and about the system, the fact that it's an outdated immigration system and it's bad foreign policy that led to this, but this is the good solution, passing a Clean Dream Act. And my final note is that frames work best in high doses. So you don't want to reframe and create this narrative arc just once. You want to do it over and over and over again. And you want to make sure that ideally everybody who's fighting to protect immigration and for these humane policies frames at every opportunity and are using the same frames. So avoiding things like saying out of the shadows, which just reinforces people's thinking about immigrants as criminals, and using the frames that work, which I just presented. So thank you so much. I'm sorry I took so much time. And I'll just note that we have more recommendations and frames on our website, so please feel free to check it out.